Promptly a few minutes before 12, I looked up from the desk, and there stood Stalin in the doorway, wrote the president in his diary. It was midday, Tuesday, July 17th, and from the high window behind Truman's shoulder, sunlight streamed into the room. A gilt-framed Victorian still life of fruit and a dead duck hung over a small marble mantelpiece. His desk, a monstrous, deeply carved affair with huge clawed feet, had been positioned at an angle facing the door in the corner of a large oriental rug. With the Generalissimo were Molotov and the interpreter, Pavlov. Stalin had arrived the night before and was staying in a thickly wooded area closer to Potsdam, but this, like the time of his arrival and the fact that he had traveled by train more than 1,000 miles from the Kremlin, were all kept secret. It was said he had been detained by official business. The truth was he came late primarily to accentuate his own importance. Had Truman been outside waiting for Stalin's arrival, he would have seen a dozen heavily armed Russian guards materialize out of nowhere and surround the house. Then in minutes the appearance of a long closed Packard with bulletproof glass so thick that the figures inside were only a blur. As Stalin got out of the car, Harry Vaughan came bounding down the front steps to greet him like a fellow Rotarian, as George Elsey remembered. The Russian guards outside the Yellow House were not quite sure what to do. I got to my feet and advanced to meet him, continues Truman's diary account. He put out his hand and smiled. I did the same. We shook. I greeted Molotov and the interpreter. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, Stalin, the man of steel, was the single most powerful figure in the world. He was the absolute dictator over 180 million people of 170 nationalities in a country representing 1/6 of the Earth's surface, the Generalissimo of gigantic victorious armies, and Harry Truman, like nearly everyone meeting him for the first time, was amazed to find how small he was. A little bit of a squirt, Truman described him, Stalin standing about 5'5". He was dressed simply in a lightweight khaki uniform with red epaulets and red seams down the trousers, and he wore no decorations except a single red-ribboned gold star, the Order of the Hero of the Soviet, over the left breast pocket, which gave him a kind of understated authority. His small, squinty eyes were a strange yellow-gray, and there were streaks of gray in his mustache and coarse hair. He was badly pockmarked, his color poor. He had what in high Soviet circles was known as Kremlin complexion, an unhealthy indoor pallor made worse by a recent illness, and his very irregular teeth were darkly tobacco-stained. Truman had been told of his crippled left arm, the result of a childhood accident, but this was not especially noticeable. A chain smoker, Stalin held his cigarette in his right hand and gestured with his right hand only. He had unusually large, powerful-looking hands as hard as his mind, Harry Hopkins once said. Bolin, who was standing by to translate for Truman, thought Stalin had aged greatly in just the few weeks since he and Hopkins had met with him in Moscow. Stalin moved slowly, stiffly, spoke little, and in a very low tone. To Truman he seemed an old man, yet there was less than 5 years' difference in their age. Born in abject poverty in Georgia in 1879, Stalin was the son of a semi-literate drunken shoemaker and a doting mother who took in laundry. Initially, before turning revolutionary, he had studied for the priesthood. Truman, in his freshly pressed double-breasted gray suit and two-toned summer shoes, looked a picture of vitality by contrast. They sat in overstuffed chairs, flanked by Burns, Molotov, Bolin, and Pavlov. Truman told Stalin he had been looking forward to their meeting for a long time. Stalin agreed solemnly that such personal contact was of great importance. In an effort to ease the tension, Burns asked Stalin about his habit of sleeping late. Stalin said only that the war had changed many of his habits. Truman tried an informal reference to Stalin as Uncle Joe, the nickname Roosevelt had used, but this too fell flat with the humorless Russian. Truman said he hoped to deal with Stalin as a friend. He was no diplomat, Truman went on. He would not beat around the bush. He usually said yes or no to questions after hearing all the argument. Only then did Stalin appear pleased. They talked briefly of the defeat of Germany, Stalin saying he was sure Hitler was alive and in hiding somewhere in Spain or Argentina. Then, abruptly and entirely on his own initiative, Stalin said that, as they had agreed at Yalta, the Soviets would be ready to declare war on Japan and attack Manchuria by mid-August. He had already assured the Chinese that Russia recognized Manchuria as part of China and that there would be no Soviet interference with internal political matters there. Truman said he was extremely pleased. But Stalin, as if to be sure Truman understood, repeated that by the middle of August the Red Army would be in the war with Japan, as agreed at Yalta, to which Truman expressed his every confidence that the Soviets would keep their word. At this point, Harry Vaughan slipped into the room to ask Truman in a whisper if he was going to invite these guys to lunch. "What was on the menu?" Truman whispered. "Liver and bacon," Vaughan said. "If liver and bacon is good enough for us, it's good enough for them," Truman replied. When he asked Stalin to stay, Stalin protested, saying it would be impossible. "You could if you wanted to," Truman said. And Stalin stayed, for creamed spinach soup, liver and bacon, baked ham, julienne potatoes, string beans, pumpernickel bread, jam, sliced fruit, mince, candy, cigars, which Stalin declined, and a California wine that he went out of his way to praise. Truman thought the whole occasion went well exactly because it was so spur of the moment and informal. He liked Stalin, he decided, and I felt hopeful that we could reach an agreement satisfactory to the world and to ourselves. But Stalin nearly always made a good impression on foreigners. Churchill, who once called Russia a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and who warned both Roosevelt and Truman repeatedly of the Russian menace to Europe, confessed still to liking Stalin the man. Roosevelt had been convinced almost to the end that he could get along with Uncle Joe. "The truth is," wrote Jimmy Burns, recalling Stalin's performance at Yalta, "he is a very likable person." Joseph E. Davies, who had been ambassador to Russia briefly and would be at Truman's side daily at the Potsdam conference table, had said in a superficial and immensely popular book, Mission to Moscow, published in 1941, that Stalin was uncommonly wise and gentle. "A child would like to sit on his lap and a dog would sidle up to him," wrote Davies. Even Eisenhower, after a visit to Moscow later that summer, would describe Stalin in much the same fashion, as benign and fatherly. Truman, as he wrote, found Stalin to be polite, good-natured, businesslike, honest but smart as hell. There had been not a hint of contention between them. The conference hadn't even begun, yet already Truman had achieved his main objective, as he recorded triumphantly in his diary. "He'll be in the Jap war on August 15th. If he need Japs when that comes about, I can deal with Stalin." That Stalin was also secretive to the point of imbalance, suspicious, deceitful, unspeakably cruel, that he ruled absolutely and by terror and secret police, that he was directly responsible for destroying millions of his own people and the enslavement of many millions more, was not so clearly understood by the outside world at this point as it would be later. Still, the evil of the man was no secret in 1945. In a February issue published just before Yalta, Time magazine had noted that Stalin and his regime had deliberately caused the deaths by starvation of at least 3 million peasants and liquidated another 1 million communists who opposed his policies. "Facts are stubborn things," said the article, borrowing a line from Lenin, and these were the facts. Actually, the facts were more horrible. Probably 5 million peasants had died. Probably 10 million had been sent to forced labor camps. "I was remembering my friends," the composer Shostakovich once remarked, "and all I saw was corpses, mountains of corpses." Stalin himself had told Churchill in 1942 that 10 millions of peasants had been dealt with. At one point in 1940, during the Hitler-Stalin Pact, he had had many thousands of Polish officers murdered in what became known as the Katyn Forest Massacre. In truth, Uncle Joe was one of the great mass murderers of all time, as much as Ivan the Terrible, his favorite Tsar, as much nearly as Adolf Hitler. Yet, wrote Bolin, there is little in Stalin's demeanor in the presence of foreigners that gave any clue of the real nature and character of the man. Stalin had perfected a talent for disguise. At Tehran, at Yalta, at Potsdam, and during the 10 days I saw him during the spring of 1945 with Hopkins, Stalin was exemplary in his behavior. He was patient, a good listener, always quiet in his manner and in his expression. There were no signs of the harsh and brutal nature behind this mask. The mask was the artifice of an accomplished actor, and it rarely slipped. Once was at Tehran. Churchill had been arguing that a premature opening of a second front in France would result in an unjustified loss of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. Stalin responded, "When one man dies, it is a tragedy. When thousands die, it's statistics." 20 years in politics had taught him a thing or two about people, Truman thought. He had only to look a man in the eye to know. "I was impressed by him," he would write of Stalin, remembering this first meeting. "What I most especially noticed were his eyes, his face, and his expression." With the lunch over and the opening session of the conference not scheduled to begin until 5 o'clock, Truman went upstairs in the Nightmare House and took a nap.